Okay, we're back again, and thank you for joining us. We have Laufey and Paula Gould and myself, and this week we're going to be talking about toxic masculinity. Um, this is sometimes when you bring that up for some people, it's a trigger, and they think it's a false thing or whatnot. But we're going to discuss it and see how we perceive it, and go through maybe some of the ways we identified, or how it's been traditionally identified. Um, so I would like to start off just by getting into it and saying, what is toxic masculinity? Having two women here who have been in the world, please, what is your impression of toxic masculinity? What would you say it is?
I can go first if you want. To the debate about whether it exists or not, I don't consider that a debate. I think it exists. I have experienced it. I know men, women, and non-binary people who have also experienced it, and have been subjected to violence because of it. So I don't really think that there's really much of a debate on whether it exists. I think the question is maybe, is it changing? Are we seeing an increase in toxic masculinity that's leading to violence or discrimination? Or are we just finally talking about these things openly? And so it feels like there's a higher incidence of it. So those are the
Paula,
questions that I would pose.
I'm sorry, could you tell people what it is that you do? What's your work experience?
Yeah, so my work experience has very little to do with any kind of formal research or psychology training. I'm just speaking as a woman in the world. But my background is working in a lot of different industries, a lot of them male dominated. And I do go to market and growth strategies for either scaling companies or companies that are looking to reach new markets.
Interesting.
So most of my work experience has been in the entertainment sector, advertising, and deep back-end tech.
Interesting. Really cool. Okay, Loewe, what would you say, your impression of toxic masculinity? What is your experience with coming across that word, or even situations where you would say, yes, this would fall into that definition?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Paula. It's something that us women and non-binary people and people of other genders have experienced, and even some men have experienced also. So yeah, it's kind of hard to explain, and I think it's one of those words that is kind of misunderstood a lot. I think it, or many people think that, like it's saying that it's negative, like masculinity is negative, which is absolutely not the case. Right. So yeah, we have experienced it, and it's often, I mean, you know it when you see it. And I mean, I have, yeah, my experience is, I mean, I have done gender studies at the university, but only a bit, though. I'm not a, yeah, I don't have a master's degree in gender studies, but I do hold a bachelor degree in political science, and I did like gender studies on the side. So I have come across the that word a lot.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I see as toxic masculinity is the unabashed just denouncement of anything feminine, right? Like, so anything that is perceived as feminine, that shows empathy and kindness, that shows an emotional, and by emotional response, I mean what's viewed as non-male. So like male response, that's anger, right? If somebody has a temper tantrum, which, you know, I've seen a lot, that's not considered emotional in a lot of contexts. But if a woman gets upset about something that's happening, or a man gets upset about something that's happening, and they show sadness or like deep empathy, or hurt, and are vulnerable in that hurt or that sadness, then they're emotional. And I've often joked, or at least half joked, that I don't understand how in certain situations I was considered emotional when I was actually de-escalating a male executive who was having an absolute temper tantrum in front of a team. And I was like, how am I the emotional one here? So, and I was like, since when is anger and an inability to verbalize an emotion, which is usually, comes across as anger, how is that not an emotional response? Like, how can I not say you're being emotional, right?
Now, being the only male in the room, it's interesting because I grew up in a very toxic culture. Now that I look back, there's things I look back on that I did with just groups of guys around, and the things we talked about and how we just perceived the world was just so like embarrassingly ignorant. And I mean, even the movies and just everything, we were drowning in a very weird, ignorant pool, just from everything that came at us. And we kind of, and that's just the way it was, so to speak, until for myself, I always had a lot of female friends, and my female friends were pretty strong-willed people and would not hold back on what they thought about things, which was great for me because it really kicked my ass, pardon my French, and challenging my worldview. And this toxic masculinity thing didn't really hit me until really the past couple of years. And it's so clear. It's like, how do you argue it? Now, and it's so public. It's like, how do you even argue it? And what I'm talking about is the conversation that Donald Trump had on network TV that was supposed to be not recorded, where he's talking about grabbing women, and the response of the reporter to that, instead of being like, hey man, that's kind of messed up, he's like, yeah, that kind of like.
I think that happens so frequently, even if I'll give the reporter the benefit of the doubt, but knowing of the reporter, it's just falling in line in locker room talk. But I've had situations where other men were uncomfortable with the direction a joke or a certain conversation we're heading, and I've laughed along with certain things just because I don't want to always be the fun police, right? And like women are, and really anyone who is the butt of the joke, or this, the wrong end of the joke, I guess, runs into those situations where they have to decide on the spot, is this, am I getting up on my podium right now and setting an example for everyone around me, or am I just like picking my battle today and just laughing along with it? And it's happened so many times, but I have had situations, I can think of one since living in Iceland, where I worked in a culture that was heavily male, and I would say at times pretty toxic. And a person who had he wasn't an executive, he came up to me one day, and I was the only female executive in the company, and he said, like, I find these jokes really uncomfortable. And I was happy that he told me that, but I was also kind of annoyed that he told me, the newest person in the team, the only woman on the team, and he had like kind of deep relationships with all of the other people around him, his colleagues and his superiors. And I said, I'll obviously address this, right? It's a concern you brought to me. I'm an executive on the team, and I am also uncomfortable with some of the joking. I said, but you chose the one female executive to address this on your behalf, right? Like, and that shows me that there was a peer fear of appearing either weak or uncool, So it was just easier for him to allow the one female on the team to address it. And, you know, I was in such conflict in that moment because of course I was going to address it. I had already addressed several jokes and behaviors and chat channels, like internal chat channels and stuff. But it was very difficult for me too, because it further separated me from the team, right? Like it put me in a position to reinforce to all of the men in the room that I'm different. And so that like, I'm not cool with them. I'm not gonna, you know, like they have to hide certain things from me. You know, and it was my understanding actually that after addressing a lot of these different things, like there was like a hip chat or a Slack channel that a lot of kind of really disgusting things were happening in. And I took a few screenshots of it, sent it to some people on this management team. And I said, what would happen if this made it out into the public? And I said, you know, how would that make this company look? And I said, it's not only uncomfortable to be in this environment where this is just rampant, but it's also, you know, a potential hazard to the brand. And I actually had to put it in the context of the actual financial or brand reputation in order to actually present it. And then I kind of took the position of being like the mom in the room, and that's exhausting. All right. So it was, you know, it's just a serious thing. Luckily, the executive team that was there at the time took it very seriously and shut down those channels. But to my understanding, there was another channel that was opened that was like not suitable, you know, like not suitable for work. There was a channel that I didn't have access to that was not suitable for Paula. And I found out about it after the fact. You know, somebody had mentioned it to me in a joking context, and I was like, well, I mean,
yeah,
what am I supposed to do with that?
I find a lot of parallels with this when it comes to race as well. Is this offensive? But you know, the N-word came up a lot, and in music, you know, I remember hearing it in a KFC with my two young kids, and I found it highly inappropriate. Some rap song was like Eminem.
Yeah, there's no radio edit here, is there?
No radio edit, you know, and I was just like, gee, this is am I the one? Nah, then if I am the one, then it becomes, yeah, you're the one. You know?
Yeah, and on TikTok right now, right? On TikTok right now, there's like a song going around, and all of the TikTokers, they just do this part when the N-word comes up, but the N-word still comes up. So they're just like, I didn't say it, right? And you know, that's disturbing.
Well, see, now this gets into like, it reminds me of when we did the protest and we were doing the speakers, and a couple of reporters said to me, Icelandic reporters said, why should we care? And I thought it was, I didn't take offense to that, but I thought it was so brutally honest. I appreciated the frankness. And that is kind of I think the mindset. When we talk about toxic masculinity to a male, it's like, well, why should I care? And that is really the core of it. What is the problem with it? And the problem with it is, I think it's that opening for worse things. I think it's
100%.
It just allows worse things to exist or to come in through that little hole that you've allowed.
Yeah, the microaggressions, right?
Exactly.
And also, I mean, if I may add the fact that toxic masculinity is also against men. I mean, toxic masculinity, for example, shames men for having emotions,
for
showing their emotions, or being kind and compassionate. You know, so this.
I've actually experienced that. You know, when like I said, a lot of my friends throughout my life and through high school were women, and I found myself many times saying to a couple of guys, making comments about women I know that I found to be inappropriate or wrong, and only because I really knew instinctively as a male that would lead down a dark path. I see, wisdom is like knowing the end of something. And I knew that just continually saying these kind of things, these derogatory things, or referring to the women in our group in a derogatory manner was just going to open up to worse things.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I've seen that. I've been on college campuses and just seen that slow progression.
Mhm.
And then, you know, when something terrible does happen, it's muted.
Mm-hmm.
Like from a male response, it becomes a muted response. Like when a woman is attacked, or the date rape thing on college campuses was a big thing, but it becomes muted because then instead of owning any kind of contribution to that on our part as men, we kind of, well, what was she doing, or what, how much did she drink, or it
100%.
becomes,
You're making
yeah.
a really solid point, because what I find is that if you take a look at the act of violence, right? So when somebody is attacked, or you know, or you talk about date rape, what is it that led up to the empowerment of that action, right? And a lot of it is cultural. A lot of it is not holding people accountable for personal autonomy. And when this happens over and over again, I mean, like, I think since I was in college in the 90s, and where I see young people in their late teens, early 20s now, and the difference in conversation, it's very clear that we're moving forward in a lot of ways. You know, you don't hear as often, well, like, she was so drunk, right? Or what she was wearing. I mean, there's definitely still circles where that happens, but I remember having conversations like that, and you know, and incidences that happened to friends of mine where, you know, an act of violence happened to them at the hands of men who felt that they had a right to that person. And in the public, when it reached the public, as these things often do, especially if it involved a frat house, um, you the person who was the victim of the violence was the one that had to speak to why this happened to them, right? You know, like, I know, at South by Southwest one year, a little over a decade ago, I had somebody grab me while I was just standing in a crowd dancing at a concert. And it was so galling, and I was simultaneously, like, frightened, ashamed, because everyone around me saw it, perfect strangers saw it, and a girl standing behind me who saw, like, the whole progression leading up to being accosted, like, I was in absolute shock, and she turned around to me and said, like, why didn't you like, she's like yelling at me, and I'm still processing the fact that somebody just, like, accosted me, right? And and to this day it still shakes me when I think about that, because it's, you know, there's so many things that just immediately became my fault. And it wasn't the fact that there was a creep in the audience grabbing women, right? And, like, and no one around me grabbed the guy or tackled him, right? And in some ways I was also in that position to be made to feel fortunate that something worse didn't happen to me, right? And, you know, like, I came out of that situation relatively unscathed. I was grabbed and then, like, you know, threw an elbow or something and just, like, made myself safe in that moment. And then everyone else just stared as this guy squirreled away into the audience, and you know, for all I know, attacked somebody else. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of things around, you know, bystander culpability, and just microaggressions that empower somebody to do something like that.
I mean, I think it's so important to speak these truths and to say these things, because, like, as you know, I'm 50 years old and I haven't heard any of this until I was, like, in my 40s, and women that I grew up with, you know, now they tell me things that I'm like, if I never knew at the time, was
Yeah.
going on, and it surprises me
And it's probably 10
that
times as much than you know.
yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, the things that have happened to him just
Yeah.
surprised the hell out of me. Like,
Yeah.
really, that was going on? I had no idea. And though I have seen it, I work in the food service industry, and I've seen guys grabbing waitresses, and I've had to
I've
go
had
up
that,
to a
yeah.
few guys and literally grab them
Mm-hmm.
to say, you know, what the hell do you think you're doing? Like, you know,
Yeah.
because and what infuriated me about it is they only saw this woman one-dimensionally. Whereas I
Yeah.
knew this woman was working her ass off, going to school, had kids, and you're treating her as if she has no self-determination. Like she's
Or
just
not only that, but that she's somehow subhuman to you, right? Like,
exactly. Like
I
this
mean,
is
yeah.
that was the level of offense. It wasn't like
Right.
so much, oh, you shouldn't grab a woman. It was like, this is a person that you don't
Yeah.
have the right to, period.
Yeah, and it
And
compounds very quickly, right? Because then you
yes,
have somebody dehumanizing this to make themselves feel like cool in their group or whatever, or because they think that they have the right to. And all of the other people in the room that are standing around there are just giggling along with it, and nobody is saying, "Hey, you know, that that woman has a right to her autonomy and to not be devalued, defiled, or demoralized."
and
And yeah.
I'll have to put out, you know, just for men who might be watching, it's not that, you know, I'm some hero, because there have been times where I've been silent because I questioned within the where I was or who I was around. You know, I've been in fraternity parties where I've seen things and been kind of like, should I be the one to say something right now, or she shouldn't be going with this guy, and things
Right.
like this, that, you know, being young, I didn't
Mhm.
have the steel within myself to be that one.
Yeah.
But really, it really takes that one. And I say a lot of guys don't know um, these stories.
Mhm.
These like you go through your day, it's like, and you have to deal with this extra level of things.
Yeah.
And I can relate to that being African American. It's like going through and being perceived without being known,
Right.
being looked at without, you know, anything further. You
Yeah.
know, a woman walks into a room and there's judgment. What is she wearing? Too much makeup, not enough makeup, tight clothes, loose clothes. The clothes aren't good enough. So that means, and it's like, it's weird how, as human beings, we are all quick to judge. And I think it comes from a lot of what we see. It's a
Mhm.
lot of what we learn,
Mhm.
uh, but it can be unlearned. And the way it's unlearned is
Right.
really by the truth.
Well,
And
I think part of that too is, and you make a really good point about acknowledgement of like the times you either said something that could, by today's standards or by your view of yourself today would be like, I can't believe I did or said that. And I think we all have that. And women in particularly internalize toxic masculinity, right? Because it's thrown at us from a very young age. So, I'm 45 years old and still decoupling myself from some of the values or experiences that I have had throughout my life, and look at things from a different perspective now. Like if I see, especially because I work in heavily male environments, if I see somebody being like, yeah, she doesn't know what she's doing, or she's an idiot, or why did you, like, I question it now. I used to, when I was young, be like, yeah, she's probably really bad because these guys are saying, this. And now I actually question it. And I was like, is she though? you know? And a lot of that just takes maturity. It's influence from younger generations who see things more clearly than we saw, just like we saw things more clearly than the generation, ahead of us did. And I think that the goal is to always improve. And I think because people they're walking on eggshells because they don't want to acknowledge the fact they might be found out that they did something that they said or hurt somebody, and like we don't have a maturity to respond to that, being like, I can see now why that would have been hurtful, and as a result we don't move forward as fast.
Now, there's a good point. I love Dave Chappelle, and I think he brings up a lot of this in some of his specials. A lot of the backlash. It's like there is no perfection, and everybody has fault.
Yeah.
And there came a time in like some of the Me Too movement where it's like, you did something bad, you're gone. And it's like nobody's perfect. If you take that standard, a lot of people are eliminated, and even those that you might want to be your ally. And we have to acknowledge a little humanity in our own, none of us are perfect saints, but I think what you got at was the desire to at least move forward. And I would couple that by the two events that really stick out of my mind when it comes to toxic masculinity, as far as people accepting it or not. It's really irrelevant because it is the Brett Kavanaugh hearing and Donald Trump himself.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the Brett Kavanaugh hearing was so interesting in so many ways, because they were talking about this man in a leadership position, and during the hearings, he was out of control. He was like, talk about emotional. He gets emotional talking about calendars. Have these calendars. They did a great SNL skit on it.
Right.
And at the same time, they were talking about Hillary Clinton being emotional as a woman, as a leader. And it was just like, you're not seeing the same thing I'm seeing, and he was like, and I was like, this guy, you talk about emotional beings? Come on.
Well, I mean, bringing up the Kavanaugh, it's a really good segue into your points about people's pasts. I mean, one of the worst things about Kavanaugh is that he did things when he was younger, and who knows thereafter, where he wasn't held accountable for it. And then years later, when several people come out and say they had bad experience with them, we default to, hiring private investigators to find ways to discredit and vilify. Like big corporate is very, very well known for that behavior, the discredit behavior, the politics obviously as well. But, I have a lot of trouble, like there's different degrees of, we all have our flaws, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I could have said things out of ignorance that I didn't realize what they meant. But I have never sexually assaulted anyone.
Mm-hmm.
And, and I think that even with, the bigger conversation about, having done bad things and then atoning for them, that's a different story. He still has not atoned for those things. In fact, he still categorically denies them. And I think that that's the defining difference, right? Like I think people are more willing to say, hey, this person deserves another shot if that person takes some level of accountability. And the reality is that in most cases, especially with respect to violence and harassment against women and non-binary, and there's an entire like laundry list of categories of people that like nobody is addressing the microaggressions when they happen, and a person's personal autonomy. So that person is empowered to do something a little bit more scandalous or violent or harassing towards somebody, and then they build up this confidence because everyone's telling them you're not going to be held accountable for this. I mean, it speaks to your comments about race, right? And what we're seeing, particularly, I mean, this has been happening obviously for a very long time, but particularly the spotlight that was shown on this year. And I think that's the hardest thing for me, is like when we talk about cancel culture, there are definitely some people that deserve to be canceled.
I would agree.
And what's worse is that for some reason, these people who should be canceled and are being canceled, you know, we, especially in the States, we love an underdog comeback story. And while they're being canceled, their comms machine and the people around them are already positioning them for their comeback story. And that's awful. Because what about the comeback story of the people who are victimized by them for violence and harassment, who are excluded from social circles, who are excluded from job opportunities, who are excluded from financial gain, or you know, like personal brand gain, or just being able to be a human being on equal terms?
Now, this is a good point brings up. Laufey, I hear you really, because I see you want to say something. But do you think the society is at the level of growth in a spiritual sense to, it's such a fine thing about like what you're saying about those deserving of a second chance and those who really haven't earned it. And because someone has done something in the past, when is it that we, or what I'm saying is, is society ready to allow that? And I think that's kind of in a lot of, and I refer to Chappelle because it's just the thing that influences me the most right now on this subject, is when he talks about the cancel culture and how sometimes it goes a little too far, he feels. I don't know if society is ready for that level of intelligence or wisdom to not. I did a post on Facebook because I hate the segue. I'm sorry, but these things kind of came up at the same time. I was watching Lord of the Rings, and there's a character Gollum, and he's practically irredeemable, and he's only focused on one thing. It's a lot of things, and one of the characters says, "Oh, they should have killed him when he had a chance." And the wizard, who represents wisdom, he says, "Don't be so quick to deal out death and judgment, for even the very wise don't know all ends." In other words, you don't know what the end of someone's story is. And to be quick to judge and just write off may be that which diminishes us all.
Right.
And I don't know if society, because society loves to jump on a person and never reflects. Never reflect. It's always like outward and very, very rarely inward. And not to say anything about someone who was victimized at all, but like you said, someone who has victimized someone, you know, instead of looking into this, it's always like some apology. And then it's like, well, I'm going into rehab and then everything will be fine. You know, then we don't have to talk about this ever again.
Oh, Shia LaBeouf, you mean?
You actually have to change also. It's not, you know, enough just to go to rehab. You also have to work on yourself and, you know, kind of change behavior. So, yeah.
And that's the work that needs to be done. It needs to be done in so many areas that we see now with male and female relationships and race relations. And it's like, I have met people who were very racist in their views in the past that I've talked to and have come to understanding. I mean, when I was younger, that happened to me. When I was in the military, you know, a guy had said to me, all Black people were N-words to him. And that's what he grew up in. That's all he knew. That's all that he was surrounded with. And it wasn't until after spending a lot of time with me that we talked, and we talked deep, because it was the first time he was allowed to, like you said, maybe express some empathy or be able to be something other than what others had expected him to be. And I think for men, that's a big thing. Like whenever, you know, there have been times where I've said something for women or to lift women up that I've been, oh, he's a wuss, or he's a, you know, this, or
100%.
he's just trying to get into someone's pants because he wants to get on their good side. And it's like, no, this just is the right thing. And being allowed that, I've surrounded myself with men who understand that. And unfortunately, I haven't come across a lot. I've come across older guys here when I worked my work experience in Iceland, who I'm shocked. I'm like, you guys have a country that had a female prime minister. We in the States never even had a female president. But the things that I've heard out of some of my Icelandic bosses, I was like, wait a minute. Do you understand?
Yeah, I mean, the moment that Jordan Peterson was able to sell out to large scale events in Iceland, I stopped. I mean, I had formally stopped before then, but I had stopped feeding into the machine and the brands that, you know, Iceland is #1 for gender equality. And I posted about this on Facebook. I had actually intended to write an article about it, which was born out of multiple discussions with multiple people. But one that stood out in particular was a conversation I was having with some girlfriends about just the things that we experience here. And we are lucky in a lot of ways. And I think that that's toxic. You know, a friend posted on a Facebook group about toxic positivity. And I was really happy to see her post that. And, you know, the toxic masculinity feeds into that. We're supposed to feel really good about the fact that we live in the #1 country for gender equality. And there are many aspects of living here that I really deeply love. But I don't think that you can exclude the fact that Iceland still has a tremendous, you know, task ahead of itself to actually properly represent non-male members of society. And one thing that a friend of mine said was that Iceland is the least worst place to be a woman. And I really just, that just sunk into my gut so deeply, you know. And of course we were talking about it as kind of a joke, but that is the reality of things. You know, like there's so many elements of, you know, grandfathered in toxic masculinity or just views of people who are non-male that we still have such a long way to go, right? And, you know, and we can't rest on that laurel that the data that makes us #1 in gender equality excludes the, you know, how many cases of domestic violence are prosecuted versus the number of domestic violence cases that are reported. And when you look at the domestic violence cases that are reported, you know, like there's so many more that are not. And like that's the one thing that really sticks with me is, you know, is the idea that just because you know, an organization has named us the #1 for gender equality 11 years in a row doesn't mean we're actually the best, like great for women. It just means we're better for women than the current standard that we're seeing in other countries.
Wow. Laufey, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Being an Icelandic white woman who has grown up in Iceland, I have kind of followed this, and I'm also, you know, I'm 46 years old, so I was born in the 70s, so I have, you know, seen a few decades of Icelandic women's rights. And yeah, I absolutely agree with Paula. It's yeah, we come up as this haven for women, for queer people, for, you know, minorities. But we know that in reality, it's, you know, there is stuff under the surface that people are not seeing in those numbers or in those statistics. And I mean, I also wanted to just address that. I mean, we have to, I mean, Iceland was, you know, homogeneous some society for a long time. So there are certain things that are just kind of engraved in our way of thinking, and we can change that. You know, we can change our own minds. We can expand our thoughts. We can, you know, read. We can, you know, get introduced to other people's experiences and listen. And the thing with the fragile, the masculinity and male fragility, this is something, and white fragility also. this is like if people are called out for saying certain things, they tend to take it personally or take it as a personal attack, as opposed to just, no, I'm just addressing what you just said. I'm just saying what you said. There's something wrong with your speech, with what you said. And they often take it as a personal attack.
Yeah,
I mean, this is a problem. And I think that this comes also in with the accountability, to take accountability, to be able to say, oh, I'm sorry, I will, change my way of thinking, or, view this in a different way.
I think a really good example of of listening to culture, or listening to generations kind of below you, right, in age, is like we spent so much time fighting older generations about like, hey, that's racist or that's sexist, and then we, for somewhere along the lines, just stop. Like when the next generation comes in and tells us these same things about our own views, we put a hard stop, just like the generation we were fighting before. And I find that really fascinating, and I've always been really aware of that. And I had an example where I was at a company party, this is several years ago, and we were doing karaoke, and everyone was having fun, and I didn't realize I was the old lady in the room, but I was. And so I was really into 90s hip hop and early 2000s rap, and like, I know all of the words to various Tupac songs and things like that. It's just, that's just where I was at that age at that time. And so I just started singing along to I think it was a Tupac song, right? Every lyric. And midway through, a woman of color who was in the room turned to me, she's like, you can't say that. It's not your place to say that. And I felt so stupid because she was 100% right. But in my mind in that moment, I was transported back to a time where I wasn't, like, nobody was calling anyone out for that kind of stuff. And instead of feel like letting my own discomfort like rule my reaction, I just apologized, because she was 100% right. And a lot of people I find, and there's probably other things, other situations where I've been defensive that I don't know about, but I think that we can all take those moments, right? And maybe that gets back to your point about cancel culture, is that like, when you're being canceled, it is a lot to take on, but how you respond to it really determines how canceled you become. And like, that was a painful moment for her, because she didn't understand why somebody, like, I looked like such a cliche in that moment, right? Like that, like, older, privileged, white, like, oblivious. And here we are again, where a Black woman has to teach a white woman what they're doing wrong, and how exhausting is that, right? And I just felt that I put that emotional load on her. But I also think that it was a real lesson for me in that moment, because it's just like, I should know better.
It's taken me a long time to get to the point where I'm open to the slings and arrows of others' perceptions, and without it diminishing myself. And I have fortunately been surrounded by my parents and people who relentlessly pursue improvement, and to understand that I don't know everything, and I don't have the answers to everything, and I'm not everything yet, has been a constant drone on my being to understand and be able to relinquish what I might believe, because we're always in a state of change. It should be that we're always in a state of change. Like everything in the world, in life and nature, evolves and changes. It doesn't stay the same. So I remember a funny one was when I was 19 or 20, a good friend of mine, and I've had a lot of white friends around me. So a lot of things I never said, I started to say. And then when I started learning more, also that influence of learning more affected how I perceive things. Like, for instance, I didn't know how many achievements women did throughout history, or African Americans, or anyone other than the white males that I've been taught. But anyway, long story short, we were coming out of a store or something, and an older white gentleman said to me something. It was like, "Have a good day, boy," or something like this, right? And the only thing that stuck out to me was he called me boy. And so I'm walking away with my friend Joe, and we're walking, and I'm like, this old white guy, call me boy. I'm not a boy. I'm a man. And I was only like 20 at the time. And I'm a man. How can you call me boy? And my, God bless him, I love him. My friend Joe turns to me and goes, Jeff, he's 80 years old. You are a boy to him.
True.
And at that moment, I had to laugh, because here I was, like, becoming Malcolm X because of what this old gentleman said. And he was right. My buddy Joe was right. Yeah, to you, he's a boy. He's 80 years old. So having a little bit of humility saves us from that fire, willing to burn everything down because we were perceived to be insulted.
Yeah.
And my father, who has studied Zen Buddhism for a long time, brings a story that comes to mind about two monks who had a vow of silence through their life. And they weren't supposed to have contact with anyone but monks. And they're walking along a path, and they see a woman carrying a bunch of heavy sacks. So one of the monks just goes up to the woman, grabs the sacks, and helps her across this little river that they came across, and puts the sacks down and doesn't say anything to the lady, and continues on with the other monk. Well, after a while, the other monk looks at him and goes, you shouldn't have done that. We're not supposed to interact with other people, and you helped that woman, and blah, 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 blah. And so the monk who helped the woman turns to him and goes, yeah, but I put the bags down back there, and you're still carrying them. And I thought, wow, that is such, there are things we can change and things we can't.
Yeah.
But a lot of times we're carrying imaginary wounds in a way.
Right.
And so having a bit of humility, I think, in this is good, but also having a determination to face truth when it's spoken to us, especially from those who may have been wounded, I think is also important.
Well, I also think that the point you make about Dave Chappelle and like cancel culture, like there's areas of that bit or, prose that I really, really like. But Dave Chappelle still is very derogatory towards non-binary LGBTQA community, which I feel kind of factors back into some toxic masculinity and views of people, or his perception of what men should be. And he also very actively refers to women as bitches, or it like just so casually. And so I have a hard time, like there are a lot of things about Dave Chappelle that I agree with, laugh about, and things, but I feel like he undermines his own message by then following up those comments with an immediately derogatory statement about somebody who's not just like him or of a different gender. So
yeah, it's taking, I take the good with the bad, but again, like I said, my personal journey is one to hopefully improve, to be better than I was, and in doing so, I try not to cut off anyone as long as that person isn't being hurtful purposefully to another person. And that's where I think the lines get blurred. Like I see it on the news in the States a lot, where everything's equal. I think that's how we got to Trump, is everyone's point of view was equal and valid. And it's like, no, some are more and some are less. And that's just life. It's the balance in the overall, but not everything is like this guy who hates women. This what was that group that had men who hate women for some reason? Like they thought they had a right to a woman. I forget the group, but it was an American thing. and they were like, men's rights. And I'm like, that's so ridiculous, but it's not equal to what everybody else is talking about, you know? So being able to put truth as the foundation
Well,
would be.
there are men's rights groups here too, and I, in theory, have no issue with men's rights groups. My problem with men's rights groups is that they're always in the context of having more rights than anyone else, anyone who's non-male, and that is the not only an undertone but the actual tone of a lot of those groups when they
Yeah.
speak about it. And that's, I take a lot of issue. I mean, it always just comes back to me to those 2 sold out nights of Jordan Peterson and then people wanting him to come back. And I think that he has very toxic messages, and I don't get it.
It's not disturbing my identity. I
Yeah.
have built a long time to create this identity for myself, and now you're going to take a wrecking ball to all that good work.
Yeah.
That's kind of what I feel it is about a lot of times. And the whole point is that to renew yourself, that's the healthier model.
Right.
People
And
don't
hopefully
want
we
to
can renew ourselves without actually, needing to dehumanize other people in order to do that. And I think that that is one of the biggest problems. I mean, when you see, there's relentless news lately of women of color and white women taking leadership roles in environments where there's traditionally either no or very, very limited leadership roles for women, and people of color. And from the perception of people who have just expected that role would go to them, it reminds me of like the debates about affirmative action in the 80s. And people were like, well, they got that role because they were Black, or they got that role because they were women. And it's just like, well, you have had your role because of who you are, because you fit what people knew. And I was like, so I don't understand why you can't see it. But it suddenly shakes the foundation of, it's not enough for you to be a white male to get that job anymore, or to have that opportunity, or to be Teflon to discrimination.
Yeah. Exactly. This is why we have those programs, because it's kind of one of those silent agreements that it should be more white male spaces. So
and we're still at such a low percentage just across the board, right? And we're already seeing pushback, like, hey, wait a minute, like this Me Too movement's getting out of control. This glass cliff situation is just like, it makes me so uncomfortable. Like, I had somebody walk up to me I was talking to at an event, and I said something about investments. And he's like, well, no one would want an investment for me because, I'm not the in vogue profile anymore. People want investments from women. And I was just like, oh, it sucks to be. And I was very sarcastic to this person, and everyone in that immediate circle of conversation was really uncomfortable that I was so sarcastic with somebody so prominent. But it was just such an obnoxious thing for him to pause, to position.
This is the, I think, like I was saying a long time ago and we're coming to the end of our talk, but this comes to what I was saying a long time ago about indoctrination as opposed to education. And I think a lot of our education has simply been indoctrination. Women's rights movements had to involve men. And civil rights movements had to involve people who weren't of color. There have always been others in support of truth, in support of what's just, in support of what's right. And we fail to see that because our education is so poor as to understand when change comes and involves everyone. So right. I can't stand when in Black movements, they're like, well, we can't hear from anybody white. It's like, doesn't make any sense. And or any movement where it's always exclusionary, because we all are connected. Whether we like it or not, we all are connected. I never understood this whole, from the beginning, subjugation of women when they are the foundation of civilization.
Mm-hmm.
Without a woman, without a woman and family.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not even people. Some men hear me say that and like, he's wussing out or what. It's like, no, it's fact. It's just fact. Would you look back at your own family? Who is the one you look to when you bumped your knee? When you grew up, it was your mother. In my own family, my son went to his mother.
Yeah.
That was the pinnacle.
Yeah.
And then when you get to be a man and women say, hey, maybe you should pay for our feminine hygiene products that we depend on.
Right.
No, that's extra. What the hell? Where's the disconnect?
Or innovations in, in women's health would be further along if women weren't dismissed as, crazy for having, like, I talk about, actually now, especially now that I'm in my 40s, and that's when like anything that is genetic starts to show up, right? And I've had conversations with people, where all of us, all women that we're all from different races and backgrounds. When we go to the doctor, especially if the doctor in Iceland in particular, most of the doctors are like near retirement men. The first question is, are you anxious? Are you stressed? And like the ownership of a ailment is placed on you. And it was like, regardless of whether I was stressed or anxious, I'm having a symptom that should be reviewed. Like, I can't imagine, and correct me if I'm wrong, but if a man walks into an office and says, I'm having heart palpitations, is the first question that they get, well, like, what are you anxious about?
Yeah.
And,
No,
and
can't experience that.
This is actually another discussion for
it is another discussion for another time. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Yeah, it's
absolutely.
But
it's beautiful. It's beautiful. But Laufey, you're gonna say?
Sorry. Yeah. No. I mean, absolutely. It's I mean, for me, being born a white woman and grown up as a white woman, but I mean, for me, my perspective changed a lot when I started bringing up children of color.
Mm-hmm.
Because that kind of that's when it hit me that there is a deep lack of, for example, just positive role models who look like them, both male and female and of all genders. And this is when it kind of hits you that like as a white person, that you think, this is a serious issue. And also because you start to kind of notice the way that especially white people respond when they're called out for, everyday racism, or, even if it's just something
and men when they're called out for sexism or chauvinism or anything else. And
no shame in being wrong. You can,
right.
And I think this is also a part of toxic masculinity, this kind of fear of being wrong and, admitting that you're wrong. And this obviously is one problem with toxic masculinity, is you always have to assert your dominance and be right. And, and you can't say, oh, I'm sorry. I
don't know the answer to that, right?
Yeah. So I think absolutely this is one of the issues.
It was very enlightening. Mary Trump, who I guess is Donald Trump's
cousin or niece,
cousin.
Right?
She's very, oh man, she is so clear and spot on. And she talks about how Donald was raised by his father, who any show of weakness, even sickness, was considered not being man enough. And it so shows that, to the point when you talk about toxic masculinity, when you see Donald Trump and he cannot admit he was wrong about anything, and even things that are so clearly obvious, that it's like to the point of putting others in jeopardy.
100%
is really the problem with toxic masculinity. And it doesn't make you look strong by being a blockhead and not accepting reality. And the reality could be that you've hurt a woman, or your opinions are toxic, or that what you're saying does not help the situation. You may have to reevaluate. The whole point is we are intelligent and we have brains, and we're supposed to use them to evolve ourselves, to continually get better. There is no plateau for a human being where you can't go above.
Yeah.
And then many people want to stop. And when others acknowledge, no, you need to keep going, that's when change happens. But when others begin to solidify that staying in one position, that's when I think we have problems, because it's usually there was a psychologist study where they give one person the correct set of facts, and then they bring in a group of people that are specifically told to deny those facts. And even though the person who has the facts knows what's the truth, if they're surrounded by people who continually deny it, eventually they give in to the group.
Yep.
And that is what I think happens too many times, too often. And one of the things that can help mitigate that is education instead of indoctrination. The media has a role to play. And unfortunately, the media is usually tied to establishment, which is, really resistant to change. And with those two things, education and media are two powerful things to overcome. And so that's why social media is a great tool, because it's open to everyone. However,
it does also proliferate that misinformation, though, right? I mean, that's what we're seeing right now. And I think that you brought up something really profound that just kind of passed right by the conversation, is the casualty of that war, right? So the casualty is people who are constantly told that they are not qualified for something, or that their opinion doesn't matter based on their gender identification. They internalize that information, and then they lose confidence, lose their ability to be vocal about their creative solutions for things, and then we all lose out because we lose that voice. And I think that is probably one of the most significant and under discussed issues of any discussion around gender discrimination, gender violence, and yeah, I mean, anything around those topics is what we lose as a result of that. I mean, you talked about history, and you talked about how, it took you a long time to learn that women had a significant footprint, and literally every innovation ever, right? And that's still true. Women are just finding out these things, like you talked about role models, and in Iceland, the one thing we've had here is role models. The strike, as itself, was thousands of role models, having heads of state who are women. I think all of these, like, that visibility does factor so significantly into things, and then treating them equally instead of trying to pick at them at every chance. Like every image I see of Katrin Jakobsdottir in certain publications are always like, they try to catch her at the oddest angle when she's talking.
Yeah, I noticed that too.
And and it's just like, I'm actually in some ways happy she doesn't specifically address it, because I think it's for us to address on her behalf. But just calling those things out. I love the group. I can't remember what it's called, but it's the group where it's like, they'll talk about women in the news, but they'll show pictures of men. like the struggle of the birth, and then it's like the soccer player. It's like, what struggle did he have?
Yeah.
It's so true. It's so true. And one of the starkest things I remember watching your news, and they were discussing women's health initiatives in the United States, and they were like, and the Council on the Women's Health Initiative.
It was all dudes.
all these, and they were
white dudes, no less.
They were all old white guys, like from the 50s,
Yeah.
It's like, wait a minute, this is a women's council?
Yeah.
Do you not see this? Do you not see this, people? But
Yeah, it's
thank you guys for this conversation. It's obviously it rolls into so many other areas. I think we should get into it again, as well as especially the medical aspects and how women are dealt with within the medical profession. I didn't know that a lot of the drugs and things they didn't even consider the effects on women in a lot of studies, which I found to be like, wow, really? There's so much that one learns when one is curious and has a desire to learn. So I hope,
and open to opinions that are different from your own, right? I mean, I think that's a significant area of things. The one thing that I really just want to end on my points is the cherry picking, right? It's the counter argument. So somebody like, well, that's not true because we have this one woman over here who's been successful, or this one woman, says that women should know their roles, and so therefore but even though the data across the board completely contradicts it, they find that, and I look at that woman and go like, oh, she's got internalized misogyny, So
there is a lot of Paula, that's such a good point, because there are a lot of parallels to if you could take this and put it into a race discussion, it would be the same thing. If you put it into immigrants discussion, it's the same thing. It's like the arguments against are usually the same as you would apply in other places. And the thing about it is, it's really facts, and it's really accepting those facts. Unfortunately, my end on this will be, in what I see in today's society is the creation of one's own reality and how that's fed constantly by social media or what they're presenting.
The echo chamber, you mean?
Their echo chamber of just fortifying my own reality in a response to the fear of the change that's happening, which makes it a sad reality for that one person, but also for us to continually move forward and change.
And also, sorry, can I just add also
go ahead. No, please.
Also to not be afraid to call people out on what they say, even if it's a person you generally like. If they're saying something wrong, to call them out on that. It's not like you're attacking them personally, you're just calling out that thing they're saying, and I think we should all do that more, So,
and call them out with empathy. I mean, that's the big thing. I feel very fortunate that most of the people in my life expect me to very directly, address something. And likewise, I get really in Iceland in particular, I don't know what to do when I'm not getting feedback, right? Like, did I say something wrong? And that's been one of the things that I've had to reckon. And so sometimes, if somebody just couched in the corner and says like, hey, this is, what you said came across like this. And I'm like, oh, okay, I understand now. And then you correct that behavior. Or if you have information that comes from a place of ignorance, and somebody corrects that, it might be a personally painful moment for you for those few seconds, but you've learned something. Whereas somebody else who's had to address that to you is exhausted from constantly having to address that.
Has been dealing with that their whole lives. So that's a lot more than one uncomfortable moment for you.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, this is, I personally very much enjoyed this. And Paula, I thank you for coming in. I really love talking with you. You were the one who got me.
We don't see each other enough.
I know. Well, it's the whole COVID thing, but hopefully that's coming to an end. But hopefully you can come in again. I love hearing from you.
Thanks.
And talking
I appreciate
with
that.
you.
Yeah.
And Paula was the one who got me started speaking, period. So I thank you for that anyway.
I was happy to prod you along because you have a lot of really compelling things to say and people need to hear your voice. So.
Thank you very much. Laufey, as usual, always good to see you.
And always so insightful.
I love these conversations. I hope we find an audience that can chime in or talk with us as well. And I think the next time we hopefully come together, we can discuss more of some of the things that we weren't able to touch on a little more deeper. But definitely important, I think, to be out
Yeah, I would love to have a session that dives into what microaggressions actually look like, because I have a list handy. Yeah.
Been working on it.
Yeah. Here it is. Yeah. Thanks again.
Thank you very much, and we will see you again when we do this again.
Good. Bye.